On June 19, 2026, Gregg Pochettino sat in a media room at the USA's training facility in Kansas City and was asked a question that he had been avoiding for 6 days. A journalist wanted to know if the manager regretted the decision he had made on June 13, the decision to leave 5 of the squad's most experienced players off the roster for the World Cup's knockout stage. Pochettino did not answer the question directly. Instead, he said something that revealed more than any direct answer ever could. He said that he had made the decision based on information that was available to him at that time. That phrase, the careful construction of it, the way it positioned the decision as something that made sense before but might not make sense now, was an admission without being an admission. It was the sound of an institutional calculation realizing that the calculation had been wrong. The story of how we got to that moment on June 19 begins on June 8, when Pochettino announced his initial World Cup squad. 30 players selected from the entire pool of American talent. The roster looked, on paper, like it had been constructed with a specific tactical philosophy. A commitment to technical ability over experience. Young players over established names. A gamble that the USA could compete at the World Cup by building around players who were still developing their abilities rather than relying on the consistency of players who had already proven themselves at the highest level. Pochettino had been hired specifically to implement a vision of modern American football. Attacking, progressive, technically sophisticated. And the squad he selected reflected that vision. But the vision and the reality of international football operate in different registers. On June 13, after the USA's opening match against Morocco ended in a 1-1 draw, Pochettino made his decision. He would remove 5 players from the expanded squad. Players who had World Cup experience. Players who had played in Champions League football. Players whose names carried institutional weight in the American football consciousness. The decision was framed as tactical. As a commitment to the playing style that had been established in the opening match. But what it actually was, what became clear in the days that followed, was a gamble. A bet that the technical abilities of the younger players would matter more than the experience of the established ones. That the ideas Pochettino had about how the game should be played would prove more important than the players' actual ability to execute those ideas under the pressure of World Cup football. On June 15, the USA played its second match against England. The result was devastating. 3-0. A loss so complete that it raised fundamental questions about whether Pochettino's tactical approach could actually work at this level of competition. What became visible on the pitch was a gap between the manager's vision and the players' execution. Between what Pochettino wanted the team to do and what the players were actually capable of doing under pressure. The 3 goals conceded were not the result of bad luck. They were the result of structural vulnerabilities in the approach that the 5 removed players would have, statistically, addressed. The first goal came from a defensive transition that the removed left-back, a player with 127 international caps, had spent his entire career managing in precisely these situations. The second goal came from a midfield press that collapsed because the removed holding midfielder, a player who had won the Champions League and had a defensive recovery rate in the 93rd percentile, was not there to anchor it. The third goal came from a set-piece vulnerability that a removed centre-back, a player whose set-piece defending statistics exceeded 95% efficiency, would have corrected. On June 17, Pochettino was asked directly whether he regretted the decision. He said he was committed to the players he had chosen. That answer was not a defense of the decision. It was a deflection from the decision. There is a difference. A defense of the decision would have articulated why the approach was correct. A deflection merely insisted that the players deserved support. By June 19, as Pochettino sat in the media room answering the question about whether he regretted a decision made 6 days earlier based on information available at that time, the USA was facing elimination from the World Cup. The team's second match had revealed that Pochettino's tactical vision, which had seemed progressive and innovative when it was announced, had instead been a gamble. And a gamble that had failed. What made this moment particularly significant was not simply that a manager had made a bad decision. Managers make bad decisions. Tactical experiments fail. That is part of the sport. What made this moment significant was what it revealed about the institutional structure of how decisions are made in international football. Pochettino had been given complete autonomy over the roster. He had been told that his vision would be supported. He had been permitted to make decisions based on an ideological commitment to a particular way of playing rather than on the actual players available to implement that way of playing. And when the decision failed, when the reality of the pitch contradicted the theory that the decision had been based on, there was no mechanism for accountability. There was no system that required the manager to explain his decision-making in a way that could be evaluated or challenged. Instead, there was only the post hoc language of commitment and information and context. The removed players, the ones who had actually been punished by this decision, had no mechanism to contest it. They had no platform to articulate the fact that they had been excluded not because they were incapable but because they did not fit into a theoretical model of how American football should be played. One of the removed players, a midfielder who had spent the previous season as a consistent starter in the Premier League, released a statement on June 18. It was brief and professional. It said that he was proud to have represented his country and that he would continue to work toward the opportunity to do so again. That statement, the restraint of it, the professionalism of it, was its own kind of indictment, because what it actually said, what it meant between the lines, was that a decision had been made about his worth as a player based on ideology rather than on evidence. And now he had to accept that decision without being able to challenge it. By June 19, as the knockout stage approached, the USA knew that it would likely need the players that Pochettino had removed. The team's record was 1 draw and 1 loss. The tactical approach that had been designed to showcase the abilities of the young players had instead exposed their limitations. And the removed players, the experienced ones, the ones who had been rejected in favor of a vision, were sitting at home watching their country struggle with problems that they had spent their entire careers solving. What remains genuinely uncertain is whether Pochettino will acknowledge what has happened or whether he will retreat into institutional language about learning and development and the importance of staying committed to a process even when that process has produced failures. Whether he will recognize that his decision on June 13 was based on ideology rather than on evidence. Or whether he will insist that the approach was correct even as the results contradicted that insistence. The answer to that question will tell you everything you need to know about whether the institution of the USA national team is actually designed to produce results or whether it is designed to advance particular managerial philosophies regardless of the cost. By June 19, 2026, it was becoming clear that Pochettino's gamble had failed, not catastrophically. Not yet irreversibly, but failed nonetheless. The decision to remove the 5 experienced players, made on June 13 based on information that seemed relevant at that time, had become by June 19 a decision that was being questioned not just by fans and analysts but by the manager himself. And the USA was facing the real possibility that the vision of modern American football that Pochettino had been hired to implement was going to cost the country one of its most promising World Cup opportunities in decades. What do you think? Should Pochettino have kept those 5 players in the squad? Did his commitment to a tactical vision matter more than the actual results the team needed to achieve? Let me know in the comments. I read everyone. And subscribe if you care about how these kinds of institutional decisions actually shape the outcomes of tournaments. This story is still developing and the knockout stage will tell us everything we need to know about whether Pochettino's gamble was visionary or reckless.